I really don't want this to be a podcast where I talk about radio, an industry I left in 2017 after almost 20 years. But for the second straight week, we've got a radio company who's trying to break podcasting.
And now, a look at what's trending in the podcast world and how it can help your show. It's the Jag Show Podcast.
Last week, it was iHeartRadio and their sketchy practice of buying podcast downloads as ads in video games. How sketchy was that? Well, it depends on who you ask. This week, it's Audacy, formerly Entercom, formerly CBS Radio before that. They're the company that saw how badly Clear Channel and iHeart screwed up the radio business and said, effectively, hold my beer. Most radio companies have invested heavily in the digital space, specifically in podcasting. Audacy, no exception. They bought Cadence 13 and Pineapple Street Media, two leading podcast studios. Well, flash forward now to late 2022, and Audacy's stock price is in the crapper, below $1, and facing delisting from the New York Stock Exchange. So in a desperate move, they're selling off, you guessed it, Cadence 13. It's the classic, the company is in deep trouble, so we need to sell something valuable to save our butts today, future be damned, mortgaging the future to save the present. Now, we've seen this before, and it's what happens when companies, radio or otherwise, get too big. They've got to satisfy the bean counters and the stockholders, and they get away from their core missions and what they do well. That's what happened at Clear Channel when they went public, sold to private equity, declared bankruptcy, and seemingly had layoffs every step along the way. That's why in a market like Syracuse, New York, there may be more radio stations than actual live DJs. The more I think about it, though, I'm actually kind of glad Audacy is selling off Cadence 13. Maybe it'll end up in the hands of someone who can invest in the product, not rob Peter to pay Paul. Keep screwing up radio, Audacy. Stay out of podcasting. On other podcast news this week, Kara Swisher is leaving her New York Times podcast and returning exclusively to Vox Media, but there are reports the New York Times, who owns all rights to her show, has repurposed her feed to do a news show. So on the surface, that might seem like a good idea for marketing and downloads. Start a show standing on third base with an already dedicated number of listeners to that certain feed. Nothing illegal about it either. But what I don't like here is the idea of eroding trust with your audience. They expect certain content from a show they subscribe to. Maybe they'll give the new content a chance, but I've got to think they'll unsubscribe. It is a story to keep an eye on for sure. The lesson, always be sure who owns your content before you start a show. For a deeper dive on that, you can refer back to this month's podcast Super Friends episode, which I co-host. There's a link to that in our show notes. Twitter rolling out its premium features with Twitter Blue, including podcasts to Android users that had previously been available on just iOS devices. Personally, not enough to get me to pay for Twitter, but I guess that differentiates me from Elon Musk, among other things. If you're looking for a higher-end podcast microphone, Logitech has unveiled the Blue Sona, S-O-N-A, dynamic mic. It's designed to compete with the microphone I use, the Shure SM7B. Now, the Shure has been used in many radio stations and by artists from Michael Jackson to Eminem. I love it. The Blue Sona is about $50 less, $350 instead of $400, and is designed to not need a signal booster like a Cloud Lifter or Fethead. For me, I'm going with the tried and true mic that's been used for 40 years, plus I already have it. But if you're watching your budget as you build your podcasting setup, the Blue Sona might be worth looking into. There is a link to the product on Amazon in today's show notes. Finally, I'm not one for shout-outs in my podcast, but I do have to give one to my colleague, Johnny Peterson, a.k.a. Johnny Podcasts. He does what I do based out of Fort Worth, Texas. He is getting married this weekend, and Johnny, looking forward to celebrating with you. His podcast called Pod Logic, and he's a great follow on Twitter as well at Johnny Podcasts, both linked in today's show notes. Until next week, stay healthy and stay safe. Later.
The most popular ways to grow a podcast are recommendations of friends and family. So share this episode with someone you know. And for any questions you have about podcasts, find Jag online at jagindetroit.com.